Welcome back to Breaking the Silence. I'm very excited today because we have Philip Mantle here, who I've known for a long time. We go back to conversations back in the 90s. In fact, Philip had one of my busts that I sold back then, and the same one that Chris Carter had. But unfortunately, I lost track of where the mold is for that one. Maybe I should bring it back someday. But I'm glad to have him here. If you don't know about this book, it's amazing. Philip very kindly sent me a copy of this book. I'm expecting a little, paperback, and he gives me this huge document. I mean, this is just amazing. I've been reading it, looking through it, and the amount of detail that's in here, and the artwork, and the documents, and the transcripts from hypnotherapies done with both of them and some other people is just amazing. And what's amazing is reading them and getting chills, because so many of the things that you've heard yourself being an experiencer with these experiences about hybrids and the like is very familiar. You're reading the same things that you were told allegedly by the intelligence that you were dealing with. So we're at a special time today because of the time difference, UK being 8 hours ahead, which I'm very used to because I was married to my late wife, who was very much a Brit, and everything was 8 hours ahead in that house because of the family and everything. So let's bring Philip on. Philip, it's been a
Good
long
evening.
time.
Yes, it has, Steve, a very long time. But, and thank you for mentioning the book.
This is amazing, and I know there's more coming, correct?
Yes, I mean, the book you have there is co-authored by myself and Dr. Irina Scott, and was published last year, actually, last September of last year.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that was it, but as soon as the book, literally, Steve, as soon as the book was published, then other material started to surface. The book didn't do that. We just continued digging. For example, one of the principal scientists involved in the Pascagoula case back in the 1973 was Dr. James Harder. Harder was sent to Pascagoula by APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, one of the main UFO groups at the time. The APRO files have been held in Arizona for years and years and years with no access to them. APRO ceased, to exist some time back. However, out of the blue at the end of last year, a gentleman by the name of David Marler at the National UFO Historical Records Center in Albuquerque was contacted by the gentleman who owned these files and said, basically, do you want them? So they signed a legal document, the files were shipped, and I know David very well, and within no time, David had emailed and said, have you got these recordings, Philip? And of course I hadn't. So I got 5 brand new recordings that I don't think anyone had ever listened to since the day they were made, Steve. So just to give you an example, on the second day, which is, the 12th of October, 1973, Harder lands there with Hynek, and James Harder put Calvin Parker under hypnosis. And he was only under the hypnosis for 11 minutes, but we have that file, that audio file. And then the sheriff who was involved, Sheriff Fred Diamond, we actually have an interview by Dr. Hynek interviewing Sheriff Diamond. Never heard it before in 1,000 years.
Wow.
What is really interesting is, of course, on the night that this incident happened, October the 11th, 1973, both men, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, were investigated by Jackson County Sheriff. And whilst in the sheriff's office, they were interviewed separately at first. Now, we have that interview that Charles Hickson made that night. So you've got the deputies in the background, tell us what happened, and Charlie tells you. This is hours, literally just hours after it had happened. And then the last recording was Dr. James Harder giving a press conference. Rather strange, because the first half of the recording, you can't hear the questions. You only hear his answers. The second half, You hear the questions and the answers, but that's what it is. So, and then more witnesses came out of the woodwork. They've been interviewed by my colleague, Dr. Irina Scott, on the telephone. And you know, I kept digging, Steve, and I've turned up a whole host of things. You know, there was one or two loose ends that I've managed to tie up.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, just this week, I have received a copy of the very first television interview that Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker did. And it was the day after their encounter. They were first sent to Singing River Hospital, had a quick check over, they were fine. They were driven to Keesler Air Force Base to be checked for radiation, and they were fine. Now, a local journalist had got a tip-off, and he's waiting for them at Keesler Air Force Base. He's a broadcast journalist, so he's got his TV camera with him, and they said, get away, go. But he said, well, people want to hear what you've said. It's already out. So he persuades Charlie and Calvin to stand with their backs to the camera while he interviews them. And we have this piece of film. And for me, it's a piece of UFO history, Neil.
It all is.
Yeah. And then what was fascinating, though, so he sent me this film. He's the guy who filmed it is still there. He's got the original 16 millimeter. He digitized it for me and sent it. But also on this film is the local civil defense officer. I can't remember his name. It's William something, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And he tracked something on radar. And he sat in his office by the radar. And I'd read about that in a newspaper, but never seen any interview with him. And right at the end, just for good measure, there's a local taxi driver that this gentleman interviews as well. And he claimed he saw this UFO land and the alien knocked on his window. That was a hoax. It was late. One of his friends, another cab driver, said I saw his cab pull up and there was nothing there. You know what I mean? So and then another gentleman contacted me. He has sent me film from 1987. So it's a few years after the event. However, you have Charlie and Calvin in a studio environment with this is, you know, for the local television, and they sat down, they are comfortable, they're relaxed, and they're interviewed. Never seen that film anywhere, ever, anywhere, you know. So, you know, more and more materials is still being uncovered, Steve. So
you don't think that film was ever released then?
It may well have been, but only on local television, because that's who they get what it was. The gentleman
it wasn't national.
No, the gentleman who sent me it, his father used to own one of the local cable TV networks. And he said he interviewed Charlie and Calvin several times, but I don't have any of that. However, in his belongings is this VHS videotape from another local station. And so he digitized that for me and sent it. And hey, presto, we have that as well. So I'm busy trying to process all this and on it.
I can feel your excitement. It's terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but what it does emphasize, Steve, not just for this case, but for any historical cases, you know, and then there are many we could point out. What is lying around in somebody's basement or their attic or their garage, you know, that's long since been forgotten about, as these two pieces of film were gathering dust. And it's only because I put a post out on social media saying I'm writing this next book. If you've got anything, you know, newspapers, photographs, anything like that, please get in touch. Don't, you know, please consider sharing it. And hey, presto, it worked.
Wow. You know, the thing that really got me was when I was watching the Netflix series that you were producing on, which was, by the way, just excellent. It was so respectful. It was just so well done. And it's so rare that you see that done with the subject matter, but I digress. The tapes you spoke of when they were at the sheriff's office, when they were, and then they left the room after they investigated, they left the tapes running, they left the tape recorder running, and neither one of them were aware of that. And you got to hear them talk to each other.
Absolutely.
about how they felt and how no one would believe them, and
Yeah.
that was just astounding because they had no way of knowing.
No.
And that was just two very honest men being very honest about what happened to
Yeah.
them.
I mean, Charlie was 42 at the time. Calvin was 18, almost 19.
Right.
Charlie had fought in the Korean War, been under fire several times. And you hear him saying, God, I thought I'd been through enough on this earth to have to go through something like this. And Calvin saying, I gotta get home. I've got to get something for my nerves. You can almost picture them almost crawling up the walls, and they weren't aware that they were being recorded. Now the sheriff's department are being quite skeptical, as you might, no problem with that.
It's understandable.
But once they heard this tape, they changed their mind completely. And what is fascinating is that the man in charge was Sheriff Fred Diamond. Long since gone, but we've managed to get some archival interviews he did at the time. And there's a newspaper interview he did not that long after it, Steve. And he said 2 days after the event, he had his own UFO sighting. So even the sheriff is involved in the story in other ways, and, the more things we dig up, we realize that many, many more people witnessed these events than we were ever aware of.
Sure.
Because people think, oh, Mississippi, these two local guys were out in the swamp somewhere fishing, but no, they weren't. They were right down by Highway 90. There was buildings all around them. As a bridge goes across the river, there's the shipyards working 24/7 on the other side of the river. So people came forward at the time in 1973 and said, I'd seen something. But once I published Calvin Parker's first book in 2018, and Calvin did some publicity for it, then people just said, what a lovely guy. He's been treated with respect. We're of the same age group. I've got nothing to lose. I might as well tell you what I saw that night. And we've interviewed literally dozens of people, literally.
That were witness to the same crap, but we're afraid to talk about it all these years because of the ridicule, and they worried about being thought of as being crazy. So and you're right. How much is sitting out there?
Well, there's one gentleman called Mr. Lewis Lee. Mr. Lee went to a book signing that Calvin was doing in the town. He bought a book, and he just said to Calvin's wife and another lady, "Oh, I saw that thing that night." And he walked away. Luckily, somebody was taking photographs. So we had a photograph of this gentleman buying the book. And I put it on social media, and we were given his phone number and permission to speak to him. Now, Mr. Lee, on that night of October the 11th, 1973, was on the opposite side of the river. He was working in the shipyard. He was a crane driver. And he says, Philip, as soon as I got in my cab, he said cab was about 10 or 12 feet off the ground. And obviously you have to have a great view. He said, sure. I could see this darn thing out over the water, not up in the sky, out over the water. And he watched it for some minutes, Steve. And he said, my colleague then down below shouted, and I had to turn away. And when I looked back, it was gone. So I spoke to Mr. Lee, and I said to him, did you report it to anyone? This is Philip. This is 1973. There is no Ghostbusters to call. Who was I going to report it to? He said, I told my family about it. I've never kept it secret. And he told us this, and he just laughed. Sadly, Mr. Lee has since passed away, but fortunately, we were able to interview him before then. That's and that just gives you one example.
This beckons a film being done of it, but I hesitate to say that because unfortunately, the people that have the money to do this correctly probably won't. That's always the problem with Hollywood. And me, I've worked in the business for well past 50 years, and I've worked with everybody. If someone like Francis Ford Coppola got hold of this, or Spielberg, they would do an honorable job. But overall,
it's funny you should say that, because we actually have a screenplay written, by two professional screenwriters, and they worked with Calvin Parker before he died.
Oh, wow.
So we have a full-length one-off screenplay.
So you're
But
trying.
we also have a 4-part TV drama series, again, professionally written.
Even better.
And again, it was written hand in glove with Calvin.
Right.
So when each part was written, it was sent to Calvin for his approval or disapproval. Same when Calvin, I published 2 books by Calvin, and everything we did, I always used to run it past him first. And he used to say to me, I mean, we became very good friends, Steve.
It's the right thing to do.
And he used to say, Philip, I trust you. I said, I know you trust me, but this is your story, Calvin. It's not mine. And I don't want to make a mistake. And I told him about the movie idea. And I said, you must realize that if you go down that route, it's not likely to be 100% accurate. It's just the way the business works. So understand that. But I said, if you write your own book, you can always refer people to the book. That is the accurate detailing of what happened to us, my book, in my own work. I mean, Steve, when Calvin reluctantly agreed to write the book, he wouldn't let me change anything, not even the spelling mistakes. That was the part of the agreement that we made. He would write it, and he'd send me a chapter, and I'd say, what about this? Add a bit more about that. I don't understand that. And he'd come back, and eventually we'd end up with a chapter that we were both happy with. But he said, under no conditions, will you ever change anything? And I said, I won't. And I didn't. And so when you read his book as well, you also will learn about the man and not just what happened to him and what he went through as well, Steve. It affected him until the day he died.
Sure. Well, the Netflix series, I mean, how long was that? Was it an hour?
No, it was 35 minutes. It's the first episode of Files of the Unexplained.
Right. But I mean, it's amazing how much ground they covered with that, which is a sign of very good filmmaking, very good editorial, because you definitely got a feel. I got a better feel for those two men than I have in years.
Yes.
And I remember in 73 when the case was in the newspapers, because I was very much, I've been involved in this stuff my entire life since I was a little kid, and with my own personal experiences. So, I really looked at that and I just thought the case was odd from the standpoint of what they saw, but knowing as much about at a young age as I did about cosmology of the universe, and I was an amateur astronomer, so I'm very much into astrophysics, and I know how old the universe is, and I know how many possibilities are out there. And to think that there's only one type of intelligence attracted to this very amazing planet. You hear people say all the time, "Why would anybody come to visit us?" It's like you're not thinking correctly. If you just have the technology to discover a gem like this planet, and the fact that there's a civilization evolving on it, you're going to come from all over if you have that ability.
Whichever way you want to look at it, Steve, the Earth is a pretty special place. It really is.
It is.
Whether we're alone in the universe, it's even more special. But if there's other intelligences out there, it is still a very, very special place.
Yeah, it is. It is. And there's also some very intelligent and good human beings here. And, the ones that always comment is, who would want to see us? We're so horrible. Well, they are speaking for themselves, I hope. So,
Well, like I said, I became very, very good friends with Calvin. I spoke to him literally a couple of days before he died.
Yeah.
And the Netflix series, Files of the Unexplained, I think that was Calvin's very last interview he did with anyone. He was very ill, had been ill for quite some time, but a tough old boot. And even though, and I said to him 2 days before he died, I said, you can't die. He says, why, Philip? I said, because your wife hasn't given you permission yet.
Yeah.
And he still managed to chuckle, even though he knew the days were numbered. And God bless him. I love the man. I really did.
Everybody fell in love with him after the special, because they got to know him. I mean, in 35 minutes, that's how well it was done.
Yeah, he was a wonderful man, and he had a great life. Not perfect.
Who has-
you know, which none of us do. But he's had an interesting life, and you know, I mean, he told me some amazing stories, nothing to do with this subject. Some of the things he got, you know, he got involved in, just make you laugh. Just everyday things. But he wasn't stupid either, Steve. He often remarked that he you know, he got no formal education. So that's not a sign of intelligence, Calvin.
That's
when
correct.
you know, you can be intelligent
That's
enough.
correct.
I said, I've met many PhDs who are the dumbest people you've ever met on this earth.
Well, yeah.
You
I
know?
can think of a few right offhand. Some
So,
are pretty fat-headed people.
but yeah. So we laughed about that, and I got to know his wife Wynette as well, and she was with him right at the beginning of all this. So she's been with Calvin right from day one, because one of the reasons that people find this hard to understand at the time, one of the reasons why Calvin didn't want to let the story out back in 1973 is he just got engaged to Wynette. She was only 16, so we needed her parents' permission to be married. And they were getting married the following month in November. And he thinks, if this story gets out, there's no way our father's going to let us get married.
No.
But luckily he did. And, you know, and she stuck with him right to the end. And she's a wonderful lady.
Yes.
And we still keep in touch. But it's an amazing story, Steve. I mean, the movie screenplay that's written is based around the experience and just before it and just after it. The drama series takes in a lot more. It's more about Calvin and how it affected his life in a very adverse fashion, and how he dealt with it or didn't deal with it at times.
The
So
human
it's
story.
absolutely. So yes, the encounter is embedded in it and intertwined, but it's also about him and his wife Wynette.
Well, you see that, I mean, it's all part of history now, and it's just, to me, it's very fascinating. It's not all about the alien abduction. It's really about how what these people's lives are all about, what they've experienced in life, and how this came along and how it maybe changed that and affected their lives, which I think is so important.
Well, yeah. I mean, Calvin
It's
had
not
got
the nuts and bolts that interest me.
No, Calvin had got his life planned. He'd met the woman of his dreams, his childhood sweetheart. They were engaged. They were going to get married. He was going to have a regular job, buy a house, have children, have grandchildren, retire. Simple as that. But that night of October the 11th, 1973, whatever you want to call it that happened that night, changed his life forever. You know, as simple as that. You know, he ended up.
It changes everybody's life forever.
Yeah, changed his life forever, and he had trouble dealing with it. I often describe Calvin like a bit like the TV series The Hulk in the 1980s, where Dr. Banner was followed by a journalist, and he'd have a you know, a fun time in one town and then move on to the next one. You know, backpack, and he was gone. Calvin actually did that in real life.
Yes,
with his wife and family in tow. One place they were living, his boss called him into the office and said, "You're fired." He said, "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." Calvin had been using a fake name. And this is, your name is different to your social security details you've given us. Fired, you know, gone. And he's got a wife and children, you know. And when
he was trying to protect them.
Absolutely. He was trying to, yeah. And so, you know, Wynette gave him, you know, a few choice words on certain occasions, you know, but he was like the real life Hulk. He didn't turn into a green monster, but if anybody caught up with him or recognized him, that was it. He'd pack up and move to the next town and get another job.
Wow. And yet, you know, the beings that he dealt with weren't monsters themselves.
No,
they actually cared about what happened, and they were concerned about it, which is why they came back. There was that feeling that they cared very much, that what they did affected his life maybe more than they had planned to. And a lot of times people are not supposed to remember, and they do anyway.
Yeah.
It's really hard to keep, I think, stuff repressed in us. It's going to leak out, whether it's in your dreams, from the subconscious, or whether you just start to remember.
Well, I'm working on the next book now. There's another one for next year. The next book, Steve, will be all of the hypnosis sessions, all of them in one volume, because at the moment they're spread across several volumes. So they will be transcribed in full in every one. And I'm hoping that we're going to make an audio book. And that audio book, part of it will be narrated, but some of the original audio recordings of the various hypnosis sessions will be used in full in their original state. So you'll be able to listen to them under hypnosis yourself.
Weren't there tapes? Didn't the tapes of Barney and Betty Hill by Dr. Benjamin Simon, they survived, didn't they?
Yes. And Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece and author and researcher, has released parts of them. So far, I've not released any of Calvin and Charlie's tapes, simply because I didn't know what the best format was to do that, Steve. I don't want to do it and make a mess of it.
No.
But what we found out is that Charles Hickson, twice in the 1980s, several years apart, underwent hypnosis with the late Bud Hopkins. And Calvin went under hypnosis with Bud Hopkins in 1993. And I have those tapes. I have those recordings. I have those recordings. We also found...
talked to us about it because I had the pleasure to have spent time with him, and he didn't talk about it.
We also have the late Dr. Leo Sprinkle.
Yes.
Under putting these two gentlemen under hypnosis. I have that recording as well. And then in the last few years, two people stepped forward, and they were called Mr. and Mrs. Blair, Jerry and Maria. And initially, they said they'd seen the UFO that night. They were on the opposite side of the river. Mr. Blair worked offshore, and there was a boat there to take him out to the rigs, but he was waiting for his boss and he was late. And she said, Mrs. Blair said he wasn't in the best of moods. She said, we saw this blue thing come down the river and move around over the river opposite as if it was looking for something, or perhaps it didn't know where it was. She knew the area, so she knew there's no landing strip there or anything like that. They then decided to walk up this little pier to the boat and put Mr. Blair's belongings on it. And she said, as we're walking up, there's this huge splash in the water next to us. And out of the water comes this grey man. And it comes literally, Steve, right up to her face like that. Not right there. And off it went. And Mr. Blair told her not to say anything, not to speak to anybody. But in 2018, they start telling us this story. Mm-hmm. About a year or so later, Mr. Blair took seriously ill. And he was in hospital. And he insisted that Maria phoned me to speak to him while he's in hospital. And he said, Philip, I lied. We saw the same thing. I saw the same as my wife did. He survived for a while longer. And he said to his wife, I'm sorry, I have to tell you this now, but we too were abducted that night. And he recounted the abduction to her, very similar to what happened to Charlie and Calvin. And it was almost like a deathbed confession, Steve, but it happened over a number of weeks rather than in one go. Mm-hmm. And despite him being ill, Mrs. Blair was as mad as hell because she'd had these little flashes of things and she couldn't make any sense of them. But once he started telling the story, they then
it starts to manifest.
Thinking, now I know what it is.
It's all there.
Sadly, Mr. Blair died. His wife, Maria, said she'd like to undergo hypnosis. We declined. We thought she was still grieving for her husband. She came back to us again. So we set up the hypnosis with a professional hypnotherapist. It was conducted at Calvin's house because she got to know Calvin and his wife became friends. We didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything, Steve. Just date, time, and location.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
So she puts Maria under hypnosis. I had it professionally filmed as well. I hired a professional cameraman, filmed it with two cameras, one close up, one wide angle.
Excellent.
And Maria starts talking. She's crying. She's very upset. She can't find her husband. She doesn't know where she is. And then it slowly starts to unfold that these creatures are there. And she said they're interested in her DNA and her eggs.
Yes,
and
right.
they want to make beings that can walk amongst us unrecognized. And Steve, you should see the look on the hypnotherapist's face, because she knew nothing about this.
Yeah, she wasn't someone that worked in this arena.
No. So
like Smith
we filmed it all. Calvin also, a couple of weeks later, went under hypnosis again, and we filmed that as well. And Maria then came back to us sometime later, and I got a colleague out in Pascagoula to film an interview just on a cell phone, but it's pretty good quality. And Maria said, I have to tell you. She went, she told us about, again, what had happened to her and her husband. She believed she'd seen at a recent sighting, as well. But she said, I also could see what was happening to Charlie and Calvin across the river, because we were that close. She said, I just thought it was men. I thought it was men doing something. I didn't know what it was. And so we have that on film as well.
Wow.
And, we've documented it all. It will go out in the new books. And like that book you've got there, Steve.
It's got her
she's in there, yeah.
Yeah, because I read it and
yeah.
It gave me chills, because what she was describing I knew all so well.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know her.
No, we leave people to draw their own conclusions. Maria has not made any money out of this. She's not asked for any money. In fact, the documentary that's Files of Unexplained, she's not in it.
No.
And we're making 2 more documentaries as well with other companies. She's not in either of them either, because, her husband had died. She went back to work. She's busy. She's got to earn a living. This is not at the top of her agenda, but she has spoken to us, kept us informed. And it's another aspect of what happened that night. It's not just Charlie and Calvin. It's much bigger than that, but had Calvin not decided to speak to me when he did, we would probably never have learned any of this at all, Steve, because we certainly didn't expect it.
But here's what I get from all of this is that, I remember when the case came forward in 1973. I mean, I'd been out of high school 3 years. And I didn't know much more about it than what the papers were reporting.
Yeah.
And it was even on television, as I recall, back then. Very blurry 640 by 480 television into CSC. And I remember some interviews with them, but they're really, all you had was their testimony. That was it. And so all these years later, because of the work that you did, and the book, and getting people to come out and out of the woodwork like they did, that who knew that there were so many people who were also involved that same night in even being abducted themselves, and witnesses to the craft, is astounding. And then the police tapes, that revealed them talking between themselves about what happened and not realizing they're on tape. It's just this heavy weight to me of solid evidence that something happened.
And there's no doubt, Steve. That's why.
No, there isn't.
No, there isn't. Irina and I had a working title for the book. We didn't like it, but we had to call it something when we were writing it.
Yeah.
And then I was sat at home one night watching a courtroom drama. And somebody said, we have to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. I said, that's the title of the book. I emailed Dr. Scott, Irina, how about this for the title for the book? Wow, bingo. Because we believe that all the evidence we presented, just in that book alone, not the other stuff that's come as follow on, if we could take that into a courtroom, Steve, all those witnesses, all that evidence, we could prove that something beyond a reasonable doubt really bizarre happened that night. We won't be able to prove they were abducted by aliens, but we'll be able to prove that something bizarre happened to those 2 individuals and others on that evening. And but we leave the reader of the book to draw their own conclusions. Here's what we have found. Here's the people we've interviewed. As you said, here's the documents. Here's the transcripts. You decide. I'm not out to indoctrinate anyone. We didn't expect any of this to happen. And God bless him, I would keep Calvin regularly informed and send him stuff when we got it. And he used to kept saying, I don't know what's going to happen next, Philip. He was as astounded as we were,
Well, sure. Absolutely. Wow. And this is just one case.
Yeah.
This is one case, and it's very well documented and very good evidence. And then you've got another classic case, Barney and Betty Hill. I brought that up before, but I mean, it's a very solid case. And what amazed me was the film that was done by Universal, a TV movie with James Earl Jones and Stella Parsons. It was beautifully done because I had read the book. I realized that the film was quite accurate to the book, almost verbatim. And that is so rare that Hollywood will ever do that. And that still holds up today.
Yes, it does. I've got a copy, and I've got Estelle's autograph framed on the wall behind me as well.
Wow. It's difficult to watch that. I found that film difficult to watch if I'm watching it for other people, because for me, when I hear Barney talking about how he felt, even now talking about it, it gets to my emotions, because if you've been there, you know exactly what he's talking about. And I can only imagine how many thousands of people watched that show and reacted that same way and didn't even know why they were reacting that way, because it had happened to them. And I did
read that it's supposed to be another movie of it by President Obama owns a film company, and they were supposedly making a new movie about it. But whether it'll appear as you know, is another thing. But despite my bias, what I would say, the Betty and Barney Hill case, fascinating. Yeah, I agree. I've listened to some of the tapes, and when you hear Barney screaming, it sends a shiver down your spine.
No. Yeah.
It really does.
Funny, I'm going to be pounced on.
But the Hill case has no independent eyewitnesses elsewhere.
No, that's true.
There is no documentation.
They're in a very remote location.
But Pascagoula does. Same with Travis Walton. Travis saw this thing, it shot a bolt of light at him, and his colleagues took off. So there's no independent witnesses, there's nothing. Whereas the Pascagoula does. It has all this, and as far as I'm concerned, there's no case as well documented as this. And when the next two books come out, with more documentation and the documentaries as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm running it through my mind, and you're absolutely right. I mean, even Lonnie Zamora, seeing what he saw. I mean, he had physical evidence and everything else, but he was there by himself.
Well, when you talk of physical evidence, when you go back to Charlie and Calvin, they say on that night, Charlie says, when these things got hold of me, I felt a prick in my arm. Felt something digging my arm. Calvin says, when I'm on board this thing, they laid me on an invisible bed at an angle. He says, and they took my bottom clothing off and my shoes and socks. And he says, they stuck something in my foot and it hurt. And he claims they were drawing blood out of it. Okay. So when I first met up with Calvin, I said to him, okay, you've agreed to do the book. Have you got any photographs, documents, anything? He said, no. I said, well, why not? Ignorant Englishman here. He said, I lost it all in Hurricane Katrina. I live right back. He literally lived 60 feet from the river. He says the house was under 12 feet of water. Everything gone. So one of my jobs, Steve, was to hunt for documentation, photographs, newspaper cuttings, anything. Now, because Hynek was there, he was one of the scientists that was on the site within 2 days. I contacted the Center for UFO Studies. She's still in existence. They said, sure, Philip, here's our file. Big PDF file, mostly newspaper cuttings, but they were interesting, Steve, because I started with nothing. However, right in the middle of this file is a one-page typewritten document. It's done on the old typewriter. And it's dated October the 13th, 1973. So it's 2 days after the event. And it's entitled Puncture Wounds. And it mentions stripping Charlie and Calvin down to their underwear, giving them a once-over visually, and that Charlie had marks on his arm and Calvin had marks under his foot. And it mentioned photographs. I'm over the moon, I've got this document, but there's no photographs in this file, so I just left it there. About a year later, the same gentleman that sent me this file from the Center for UFO Studies says, Philip, I've been rooting through a file today looking for something. I found these. I'm pretty sure you've already got them, but I thought I'd send them just in case. Hey, presto, it's the photograph of Charlie, these marks on Charlie's arm and Calvin's foot, and they're in the book for the first time.
They're right here in the book.
Yeah.
So we have this morning.
So I said to Calvin, who was it that asked you to take your clothes off and look you over? So it was Dr. James Harder. He wasn't an MD. He was I think engineering was his PhD. But he had the common sense to say, well, you've claimed you were pricked or probed. Let me have a look. And he took the photographs, and they're in the book. And again, you can make up your own mind, Steve. So we do have a physical link to the events that happened that night. We have the two witnesses' testimony. We have me finding this document, and then the gentleman nicely sending me these photographs to accompany it. And that, to me, that's a fascinating piece of evidence. I may be wrong, but I don't think I am.
No, it is, and I don't discount the markings that I get sent and that I've found from people who have these experiences. Some of them can be explained away, but myself included is, I mean, I'll go to bed and, Mary's had a good look at me and there's clearly nothing wrong with me. And there's no marks. I'm not bleeding anywhere, anything like that. And I'll wake up with something that's just unexplainable, that I would get it while I was sleeping, not to mention my covers not being on me and I'm laying on top of them, or maybe I'm backwards on the bed or whatever it may be. They do leave behind evidence in that way. And a lot of people question why anyone that technically advanced would do such a thing. But then again, they are living beings, and living beings make mistakes and or they don't really worry about something like that. If they do, you take a scraping from your body or something like that, that you have that evidence there, because no one's going to believe you anyway if you tell them where it came from. That's why when I was working with my good friend, Dr. Roger Lear, back in the 90s, and I had that incident where something was put on my skull, my brain, and drilled into my brain, which just sounds crazy, but it really happened. And when I went to Roger, because I couldn't go to my actual doctor, because there was a hole through my skull and it was oozing fluid. And what am I going to tell him? I tell him, how did I get that? Oh, I got abducted by aliens last night. They're going to think I did it to myself and I'm crazy and lock me up. So I went to Roger, and Roger looked at it and he said, yeah, you got a hole in your head. And I said, boy, you could say that again.
Yeah, but I knew Roger. Yeah.
And
lovely guy.
He cleaned me up and said, just let it heal. And, he wanted to do x-rays. We didn't. We ended up doing x-rays in my arms, and we found some other amazing things. But I believe that these things are evidence, because, I'm not going to drill a hole in my head. That's the most dangerous thing I could think of. And how would I even do it? And so I know a lot of people don't count that as evidence, but I agree with you that it is a form of evidence.
Yeah, well, we have, these gentlemen back in 1973 telling you that of these marks. And then decades later, just by me being polite and asking for assistance, I get a file with the document in it. And the gentleman who sent it, he knows me, and he finds the photographs to accompany him. And hey, presto, we have the whole story. And I contacted a couple of, medical practitioners and got a quote from them there in the book, but it's difficult when you're going with just a couple of black and white photographs.
Sure.
But had I not asked somebody in the medical profession, I would have got criticized for not doing it. It,
so you're always looking for it. They're looking to take you down every chance they get.
Yeah. So I did it, and their comments are there. And, it was another aspect of the case we never expected to find, Steve, not at all.
We have someone going by the name Morgan saying hello to you here. And I think he's asking about what you think about the mummified aliens, and he didn't finish it, but I think he's asking you about the aliens in Peru.
The fake.
Have you had a chance to look at the data that they just recently released?
I mean, a colleague of mine here in the UK called Steve Mearer investigated these some time back, and they're also linked to one of the biggest hoaxes in the UFO business, which is Jaime Masoon in Mexico.
Sure. I don't listen much to anything that Jaime has to say.
So if his name's attached to it, then be warned.
Currently, it's not. There's another investigator who went down there with a team of scientists, and they did CT scans and they did DNA on them. And according to the results that I've seen, if the results are actually real, they show that they are a DNA mix of human and reptilian of some sort.
No, forget it, Steve. Tell them honestly, forget it. They are fake.
You believe that the whole thing is hoaxed up?
Absolutely, 100%.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, that's good to know. I mean, it's just like the alien autopsy. The first time I saw it, that was back in the 90s, and
95.
I had literally rocks thrown at me because I didn't believe it was real. I said, look, I did this kind of stuff for I'm doing this kind of stuff for a living. I worked in major films like Star Trek and Ghostbusters, and we made aliens and we made bodies and dead bodies and stuff. And I'm telling you, that's not real. I just know in my gut, I know what I'm looking at. And I forget how long later it was, but I talked to a very close friend of mine who's a very well-known special effects makeup artist in a lot of huge movies, and he's Canadian-based. And we're on the phone one day, and he says, "Steve, I know the guy who did that body." And I said, "You do?" He says, "Yeah, I was over at his place." He says, "Here, don't tell anybody, but let me show you." And he took him in the back room and showed him that very body that he had made. And I'm not going to mention any names because I don't know. I know somebody came forward and said they did it, but I don't know who it was, and so I don't want to get any trouble. But that's what I know. But I always knew that.
I think that's when you and I first got in contact, Steve.
Was about that,
because I was involved in the alien autopsy furore right from the very beginning, and someone just reminded me that next year is the 30th anniversary. So I'm sure it'll rear its head again. I wrote a book about it, so all my investigation is in there. I tracked down everybody that was involved right from the very genesis, from when it was first mentioned, right the way through to today. And I'll never live it down.
No, but people were very angry they were angry at me. I don't know if they were angry at you, but they really wanted to believe that was real. And I mean, Whitley and I talked about it a great deal, and he agreed with me. I mean, he was hoping it was real, but he knew pretty much it wasn't right away. And I told him what I knew. That was that. Then we were both asked by Bob Kibia. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I know Bob very well.
Yeah, and we were asked to look at the Area 51 alien interview tape.
Yeah,
and they did a special show on that. And they had Whitley and I come in and look at the film. Well, we looked at the film first, and Whitley and I both noticed something that was very odd in the background. It was this little green light that was sort of jumping up and down, and it bothered both of us. And it was just we're still not clear why, but there was something very familiar about that from our experience that we couldn't quite put our finger on. So we went and we sat in front and watched it, and they put cameras on us. And to this day, I don't know if that was real or not, because the way it was done and the look of the being was very, very accurately portrayed. there was someone that pointed out that the torso never moved. And I have to go back and look at that. But I said it could be real. That's all I said. But the editor made it into it's real.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that just, ticked me off,
Yeah.
Then we
Well,
did the NBC special, a 2-hour special, where they told us that they wouldn't have any skeptics, and they turned Jesse Long into a liar by rigging the lie detector test. So they're known for doing this stuff.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because going back to Pascagoula, Charlie
Right.
Hickson took a polygraph exam, and he passed. And the gentleman who took it was a gentleman called Scott Glasgow, and he worked for the Pendleton Detective Agency. Sounds like a TV show, doesn't it? But
Right.
he was in New Orleans. Now, the major debunker at the time, of course, was Philip Klass, and he got stuck into this polygraph test because the examiner, he claimed, wasn't qualified. Well, he was qualified, but he hadn't received his certificate. It was en route. And rather than take a normal polygraph, he said would take about half an hour. It took him 2.5 hours. He kept doing it and thinking he'll catch him out next time. So during COVID, I thought, I wonder if the Pendleton Detective Agency is still around. And you know what, Steve? It was still there. And I contacted them, and it was still the same old boy who was in charge. And I corresponded with him, and he explained things to us. I also got hold of Philip Klass's file that he has on the Pascagoula case. It's 160 some pages long. And in there, he even interviews Scott Glasgow, the polygraph examiner. And that's all going to be in the new book next year. One of Klass's comments was, well, why did they use somebody from New Orleans, which I believe is about 60 miles away, when there was 2 agencies just outside of Pascagoula that could have done it? Well, I found out, if you dig hard enough, that the 2 local ones turned it down. The first one said, I don't want anything to do with UFOs. That, no way. The second one said, we only conduct polygraph exams on people who've been charged with a crime. Mr. Hickson and Mr. Parker have not been charged with any crime. Therefore, we decline. Now, Charlie and Calvin worked at the shipyard at Ingalls, and they were given the assistance of the company lawyer. Not that they needed him, but it was there. He happened to know the Pendleton Detective Agency in New Orleans and said, well, they'll send a guy and we'll get it for free. So they sent a polygraph examiner, and, he passed the test, did Charlie. Calvin had gone by this time. He was back home. So he passed. And so we have all this additional information that we've dug up about the polygraph exam itself.
Right.
Klass in his own way was just trying to dig some dirt, Steve. And if sometimes...
Oh, he always was.
Yeah.
You could put an actual body in front of him and he'd deny it.
Yeah, if you throw dirt, sometimes it sticks. This will make you laugh. Oh, I hope it will.
And then there's Joe Nichols.
A few years later, Charlie is, I forget which city he's in, but he's going to do a TV show that has been arranged by a journalist. And he asked Calvin to come out and meet him, not appear on it, but just come and say hello. So Calvin reluctantly agrees. Well, when he gets there, Charlie had said, oh, I'm going on TV with this scientist. But when Calvin arrives, the show has been cancelled. The scientist wouldn't go on TV with Charlie. And Calvin is oblivious. He's no idea what's going on. So the journalist who's organised this takes all of them across the road to a restaurant, sits them down. And the journalist says to this scientist, why won't you go on TV with Mr. Hickson? And he says, because he's a liar. Now, it wasn't a scientist. It was Philip Klass. So Calvin said, hang on a minute. Now, Calvin was a tough guy. He didn't really want to pick a fight with him. Mm-hmm. He says, if you're calling him a liar, you're calling me a liar as well. He says, I don't care if you don't believe us. That is your choice. But if you ever call me a liar again, you're going to regret it. Calvin said, we got sent home that night with no dinner. You know, the dinner was cancelled and out you go. But that was his one and only time of meeting Philip Glass, and he just called him a liar. He had no evidence and no proof of that, Steve. He just made it as a statement.
Philip.
Yeah.
That's just it. Neil Tyson, all of them, they all say there's no proof, there's no evidence, and there's nothing to this whole thing. There's no life after death. There's people aren't psychic. There are no UFOs. Where's your evidence? Well, what evidence do you have to the contrary?
Yeah,
they don't have any.
A message came up on the screen and it said, you know, it's all anecdotal evidence. Well, most of it is. But you can still give anecdotal evidence in a court of law, and it can convict people or prove them innocent. You know, we've got all this great technology, and you know, my daughter was part of a CSI with the police, so we've got all that, you know, crime scene technology now. But at the end of the day, there's also people who stand there. So I saw that man do that to him, you know, or I saw him break into that house. It's just his anecdotal evidence, and it can convict you.
Sure.
You know, so. To write it off, to write it off when it comes to the UFO business is just nonsense.
But people do that all the time. I mean, look how they reacted to the jury with Mr. Trump. So,
yeah.
Oh no, that's not what we wanted to hear. So that's the, you know, it's very hard, this subject matter. So you're working predominantly on this case now. This is really this because it's such a good case. You're not really looking much at other things that are going on.
Well, no. I mean, it's taken up the bulk of my time since I. What happened, Steve, was I got permission to republish Charlie Hickson's book, UFO Contact Pascagoula, that came out in 1983. He co-authored it with a chap called William Mendez. Charlie died in 2011. I didn't know if Calvin was alive or not, but I couldn't find any obituary or anything like that. So I assumed he must be. So I started to look for him. It took me a few months. Initially, all I wanted from him, Steve, was an interview. And I was going to put it at the back of Charlie's book as like an update. And I finally got a telephone number for Calvin, spoke to him, was very polite. Clearly didn't want to say much or talk to me. But we talked to a couple of more times, and I said, why won't you give an interview? He said, well, people always mix it up. If you give an interview, it doesn't come out the way you've said it. So I said, the only way to prevent that, Calvin, is if you write a book yourself. You know, your words, you know. And much to my amazement, he did. That wasn't the plan, you know, and I just said it on the spur of the moment, Steve, you know, and he said, okay. But I had to write that into the agreement that we signed, that, you know, I wasn't to change anything or edit anything out. And like I said, one of my duties on top of that was to find, you know, documents, newspapers, all that kind of stuff, which I did. And then once the book came out, then other people started to come forward, or we found them via other routes. So it has pretty much taken up most of my time, but not all of it. There's still other things coming to my inbox that keep me occupied as well. But I think maybe we're reaching the end of the investigation. There's only so much information I can dig up. Dr. Scott as well. So you'll see two documentaries this year. They're both multi-parts. They both look at the case from a different point of view, a different standpoint, but both very positive. You'll see two books. Another one later this year that is all about the hypnosis. And then next year, it's all the loose ends tied up. Calvin even wrote a piece for me that he wouldn't allow me to publish until he passed away. So that will be published next year in that book for the first time. And even his wife hasn't seen it, you know.
Wow.
And it's a very interesting piece that he wrote, you know, and it's quite moving. And all the other bits and pieces that, you know, all the loose ends, these new TV bits that we've seen. I mean, Charlie went on the Dick Cavett show, hugely popular talk show. We can't find a copy of it. But what I did find was actually the audio.
Oh,
So we have the Dick Cavett Show episode with Charlie on it.
well, that's great.
Audio only. I found one very poor quality still photograph of Charlie and Dick Cavett. So I've transcribed it. That'll go in the book next year. They were also, Charlie and Calvin went on the Mike Douglas show. Again, not being able to find
I
that.
remember Mike Douglas, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, there's other little things that there may not be significant smoking gun evidence or anything like that, but it's a way of showing you how the case progressed and how it was. Charlie also went on a TV show. I forget the name of it now. You've got three people stand there and said, I'm Fred. I'm a builder who fell off his ladder. And you've got to find out which one is the real Fred.
My line, I think.
Something like that. Well,
yeah.
Charlie Hickson went on it. And the panelists, they actually picked him out. You know, but that was Charlie's way of trying to keep this in the public eye. He believed it was important that the people should know about it. He believed that something momentous was going to happen on Earth. And these creatures that he'd met and interacted with were going to be part of it. Sadly, in his lifetime, that never happened. But he honestly believed that, Steve. And he wanted to keep it in the public eye.
Sure. Well, something is momentous is happening, and in the human race is slowly, much more quickly at this present time, is starting to understand that they share in a cosmic neighborhood and that we're not alone. And that's a big thing. That is momentous. And wow. So after all said and done, and you're done with the investigation and the case, what will be next for you, Philip?
Whatever lands on my desk, Steve, you know,
ever since a UFO, I don't know.
Well, you don't know. I mean, last year I got involved and never thought I would do with having pieces of an alleged UFO crash here in the UK analysed in labs in the States and Australia. Never thought that would happen, but it did. So what will come across my desk next, I have no idea. You know, no idea whatsoever. In the meantime, I'll finish off the books I'm writing. I'll help promote the documentaries when they come out.
Sure.
But like I say, they're both multi-part. I think the first one with Darcy Weir in Canada is going to be 4 parts. The one with a company in London called Entertain Me, I think that's 3 parts. Entertain Me went out to the States and interviewed a number of the witnesses. So they have them on film.
Is this going to be through Netflix or different sources?
I don't know yet. That's nothing to do with me. You know, that's
sure.
It'll be on Amazon or Netflix or something of that nature, I'm sure. Wow. And I can't wait to see them myself. I've seen little bits of them and I've been impressed. But you know, that'll keep me occupied, I think, for pretty much for the rest of this year. And we'll see what 2025 brings, Steve. Maybe we'll be talking about the alien autopsy again because it's the 30th anniversary next year.
Maybe.
Somebody's bound to bring it up.
Yeah, I did. So, Philip, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. I mean, I know you're a busy guy and it's getting late there. And if you're like us, my bedtime's around 9 o'clock. So
I'm all right. I'm one of those that can't sleep, Steve. So, you know.
You can't sleep?
No, I don't sleep.
No, well, we're in bed by 9. We get up at a little after 5 and we hit it every day. And what we're trying to do is what you've described. And we're trying to allow people, and we're not cherry picking their cases. We're not being judgmental. We're letting them come in from a camera and tell their stories without skeptics and all that, and just talk to camera. And I do my best that I can to visualize some of the things that they experience, whether it be the beings, the craft, or both. Or in fact, this Saturday is I don't know if you heard of it or not, but it's the El Coronado in San Diego. Yvonne Smith and I were down there for a conference, and many in her group were there, and there was what she referred to as a mass abduction, and I was involved in that. And so this Saturday, it's only a 20-minute piece, but we both sit in camera and we talk about that night, and I recreate what I remembered. It was a fascinating case because there were so many people involved, and what she did she's a good hypnotherapist, and what she did is she kept us isolated, so we did not talk to each other about what we experienced, so that she could put people under hypnosis and see if we corroborated each other's stories. And in many cases that did happen. So it's I'm hoping it helps add to the database and the history of this subject.
Well, that's all I'm trying to do, Steve. I've
Yeah.
always looked upon my job as document things as in the best way I can, and hopefully somebody will make sense out of it. You know,
Yeah.
Add to the knowledge database of this subject. Someone said I do have a YouTube. I don't have YouTube. I wouldn't know how to do it. I'm afraid I'm not that tech savvy.
No, but you do know how to do this, and this is just amazing. And I would, I'm not trying to help him make money. I'm trying to help you get information and knowledge about this subject. And this book, like no other I've read, really presents that. You have done a lot of hard work and presented the facts and so much more in this book.
Yeah, I'm not biased or big-headed, Steve, but I like to think that Dr. Scott and I have put together a landmark book there that will be talked about in years to come when we're no longer around.
I've seen it all.
Yeah, well, it's like I talk about Bud Hopkins' first book, Missing Time. I think it's essential reading and communion, and I hope that our book will be in the same vein as those.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. And Bud was an amazing guy. He was a really neat, nice man. So, well, Philip, thank you so much. And you'll have you're going to get one of your little friends back from me very shortly. And
thank you very much.
You're welcome. And hopefully we'll be in touch again soon.
I'll keep in touch, Steve. And
yeah, please do. And I will do the same. And if you ever have a chance, which I'm sure you don't, you should watch one of our shows. So they're interesting. So
I will. Good night and God bless everyone.
Yes, good night.